A homeless boy, a lost Christmas present, and a life-changing discovery. What he found inside shattered his reality and reminded everyone of the true spirit of Christmas. It was Christmas Eve, and the streets of New York were alive with the sounds of the holiday season. Crowds moved quickly, their arms full of shopping bags, while streetlights wrapped in glowing garlands illuminated the fresh snow covering the sidewalks. Carolers sang Silent Night near the corner, their voices blending with the jingle of Salvation Army bells. For most, it was a night filled with warmth and excitement. But for Ryan, it was just another cold evening. Ryan, a 12-year-old boy with messy dark hair and tired eyes, sat on a park bench clutching a worn backpack. His jacket was too thin for the freezing weather, and his sneakers had holes big enough to let in the snow. He tried to ignore the cold that bit at his fingers and toes, focusing instead on the people passing by. Families were laughing, children were pointing at the Christmas lights, and couples were sharing cups of steaming hot chocolate. It all felt so far away from him. Ryan had been living on the streets for over a year. Ever since his mom passed away, life had been a constant battle. The foster system didn't work out for him, and running away felt like his only option. Now, every day was about survival, finding a warm place to sleep, scraping together enough food to quiet his growling stomach, and hoping tomorrow might somehow be better. As he pulled his knees to his chest, he looked up at the night sky. Snowflakes were falling gently, swirling in the light of the street lamps. He used to love snow. It reminded him of better times, back when he and his mom would build snowmen and drink hot chocolate on snowy evenings. She used to say, "Every snowflake is special, Ryan, just like you." It was one of her favorite things to say, but tonight those words felt like a cruel memory. Nothing about him felt special anymore. He felt small, invisible, just another face in the crowd that no one noticed. His stomach growled again, snapping him back to reality. Dinner had been a half-eaten sandwich someone had left on a park bench and a cup of watery soup from a shelter. He was used to the hunger by now, but that didn't make it easier. He shifted uncomfortably on the cold bench, wondering where he could sleep tonight. The shelter down the block was already full. Maybe he'd find a spot near the subway entrance where it was slightly warmer. As he rubbed his hands together for warmth, something caught his eye. A flash of red under the bench. He squinted and leaned forward. It was a box, wrapped in bright red paper with a shiny green ribbon tied neatly around it. Ryan froze, staring at it. It looked like a Christmas present. How did that get here? He wondered. He glanced around, but no one seemed to be paying attention to him or the box. The crowds moved on, too busy with their own holiday plans to notice the small, forgotten gift. Curiosity got the better of him. He reached down and pulled the box out from under the bench. It was heavier than he expected, and the paper was clean and smooth, as if it had just been placed there. There was no tag, no name, no sign of who it belonged to. Ryan hesitated, holding it in his hands. For a moment he thought about leaving it there. Maybe someone would come back for it. But what if it was meant for him? What if, somehow, this was a little piece of Christmas magic? Ryan's breath hung in the frosty air as he stared at the red box in his hands. The wrapping paper glistened under the streetlights, the green ribbon perfectly tied. It looked untouched, out of place among the snow and slush of the busy park. It wasn't just a Christmas present. It felt like a secret waiting to be uncovered. His fingers hovered over the ribbon, trembling from the cold. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be watching, waiting for him to open it, ready to accuse him of stealing. His eyes darted around the park. Families were hurrying by, their arms full of shopping bags, their laughter cutting through the cold night. No one paid him any attention, just as they hadn't all evening. What if this belongs to someone nearby? Ryan thought, his chest tightening with doubt. What if they're coming back for it? He placed the box on his lap, his hands still resting on the ribbon. He could feel the weight of it, heavier than it looked, pulling him into its mystery. But another thought crept into his mind, one he couldn't ignore. What if this is for me? The idea seemed impossible, yet it flickered in his mind like a distant star. Small, faint, but undeniable. For a moment he imagined what might be inside, something practical, like gloves or a scarf, maybe food, a warm sandwich or a box of cookies, or maybe, just maybe, it was something even bigger, something that could change everything. Ryan shook his head, trying to push the thought away. He didn't want to hope. Hope was dangerous. It made the fall hurt that much more when it came. Still, his curiosity gnawed at him, louder even than the rumble of his empty stomach. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the box. What's the worst that could happen? He thought. If it's not meant for me, I'll put it back. He pulled gently at the green ribbon, watching as it slipped loose and fell to the ground. His heart pounded in his chest as he peeled back the red wrapping paper, careful not to tear it. He felt like he was opening a window into another world, one that didn't belong to him, but one he desperately wanted to see. Inside was a plain white box. For a moment he hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. This was it, the moment that would change everything, or leave him disappointed once again. He opened the lid slowly, bracing himself for whatever was inside. At first he thought it was empty, but then he saw it, a folded piece of paper sitting neatly in the center. His stomach sank. All this, and it was just a note? He unfolded it with shaking hands, and what he saw made his heart stop. It was a check, and not just any check, a check for $1 million. Ryan stared at the number, his mouth dry, his mind racing. It had to be a mistake, a joke, something unreal. But the paper felt real. The signature at the bottom, neat and precise. It was written out to cash, which meant anyone could claim it, even him. His heart raced as a flood of emotions hit him all at once. Shock, disbelief, excitement, and fear. For a moment he let himself dream. $1 million. He could buy a warm coat, a place to sleep, real food. He could have a life again. He could have everything he'd lost. But then doubt crept in, sharp and heavy. How does something like this just end up under a park bench? He thought. What if someone's looking for it? What if they need it more than I do? He looked around the park again, half expecting someone to come running toward him, shouting, "That's mine!" But no one came. No one even looked his way. Still, the weight of the check in his hands felt heavier than anything he'd ever held. It wasn't just paper. It was a decision, a choice. "This doesn't belong to me," he whispered, the words barely audible in the cold night air. But even as he said it, a voice inside him whispered back, "But what if it could?" Ryan sat frozen on the bench, the check clutched tightly in his hands. The world around him seemed to blur, the lights and laughter fading into the background. The choice before him loomed larger than anything he'd ever faced. Keep it and take a chance, or return it and risk losing the miracle he had prayed for. Ryan sat on the bench staring at the check in his trembling hands. The number, $1 million, seemed impossible to process. His mind felt like a storm, thoughts racing in every direction. His eyes kept scanning the check, looking for some mistake, some clue that it wasn't real. But it was. The paper felt solid, the ink clear and precise. It was written to cash, and anyone could claim it, including him. He swallowed hard, the cold air burning his throat. $1 million. The number danced in his mind, pulling him into a world he'd only dreamed about. Warm clothes, a place to sleep, hot meals, no more nights shivering on park benches, no more hunger clawing at his stomach. He imagined walking into a store, buying whatever he wanted, eating until he was full. The fantasy was so vivid it felt almost real. But then reality came crashing back, heavy and sharp. "This isn't mine," he thought. "Someone worked for this. Someone needs this." His stomach twisted as he looked around the park, half expecting someone to come running up, shouting that they'd lost their check. But the crowds passed by, oblivious to him and the life-changing decision he was holding. He clutched the check tighter, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. A voice in his mind whispered, "Why not keep it? No one will know. No one cares about you anyway." The thought made his chest ache, but he couldn't deny the truth in it. He'd been invisible to the world for so long. What difference would it make if he took this one chance to change his life? But another voice pushed back, quieter but stronger. "It's not about them. It's about you." "Who do you want to be?" Ryan shook his head, trying to clear the confusion. He thought about his mom, about how she used to tell him to always do the right thing, no matter how hard it was. "We don't have much," she'd say, "but we have our integrity. And that's worth more than anything." Her words echoed in his mind, making his decision feel even heavier. The hunger in his stomach growled again, a cruel reminder of his reality. He was tired of being cold, of being hungry, of feeling like he didn't matter. $1,000,000 could change all of that. But at what cost? He imagined himself keeping the check, cashing it, living a life of comfort. But every time he pictured it, a shadow of guilt crept in, dark and suffocating. "What if this belongs to someone who needs it more than I do?" he whispered to himself, his breath visible in the cold night air. The thought stung, but he couldn't ignore it. He looked down at the check again, the temptation pulling at him like a tide. He felt trapped between two impossible choices: survival or doing what was right. His hands clenched around the paper as he weighed the options in his mind. On one hand, this could be the break he'd been praying for, a chance to escape the cold, to stop struggling, to feel human again. On the other hand, keeping it would mean turning his back on everything his mother had taught him, everything he wanted to believe about himself. "This isn't fair," he muttered, his voice shaky. Tears welled up in his eyes, not from the cold, but from the weight of the decision. He felt small and powerless, like the world was testing him in the cruelest way possible. How could he make the right choice when every instinct screamed at him to take the chance? The wind picked up, biting at his face, but Ryan didn't move. He sat there, staring at the check as the battle raged in his mind. Survival or morality? Desperation or integrity? He had to choose, and whatever choice he made would change his life forever. The freezing wind howled through the park, carrying with it the sound of laughter and the distant jingle of holiday bells. Ryan sat frozen on the bench, the $1,000,000 check crumpled slightly in his hands. His fingers felt numb, but the decision in front of him burned like a fire in his chest. For what felt like an eternity, he stayed there, weighing his options. The temptation to keep the check was overwhelming. He pictured walking into a bank, handing it over, and walking out with enough money to change his life forever. A warm apartment, food whenever he wanted it, even a chance to go to school again. He could escape this life of survival. He could finally start living. But every time the thought crossed his mind, he felt a sharp pang of guilt. His mom's voice echoed in his head. "Integrity, Ryan. It's what makes us who we are." She had always taught him to be honest, even when the world seemed unfair. Ryan clenched his teeth, his breath hitching as tears threatened to spill over. He didn't ask for this. He didn't ask for the world to put such a heavy choice in his hands. The check felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of everything he wanted and everything he feared. "What if it's someone's life savings?" he whispered to himself. "What if losing this ruins them?" The thought gnawed at him, making it impossible to justify keeping the check, no matter how desperate he was. Ryan looked up at the park around him. The lights twinkled in the trees, and couples strolled past, wrapped in warm coats and scarves. He wondered what it felt like to walk through life without a constant ache in your stomach, without the fear of what tomorrow would bring. The unfairness of it all made him want to scream. Why did it feel like everyone else got to live while he was stuck surviving? But deep down, Ryan knew the answer. Life wasn't fair. It never had been, and the only thing he could control was how he chose to face it. His mom's voice came back softer this time, as if she were right there with him. Do what's right, Ryan. That's all that matters. Ryan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He didn't want to be the kind of person who took something that wasn't his, no matter how tempting it was. He didn't want to live with the guilt, the constant shadow of wondering if someone else's life had been destroyed because of his choice. Finally, he stood up, clutching the box and the check. His legs felt shaky and his heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. He wasn't going to keep it. He couldn't. The nearest police station was a few blocks away, and Ryan knew it would be warm inside. The thought of stepping into the heat, even for a few minutes, was enough to push him forward. As he walked, the city around him seemed louder, brighter, more overwhelming. He gripped the box tightly as if it might disappear if he let go. When he reached the station, he hesitated for a moment. The bright lights of the building and the steady hum of voices inside made him feel out of place. He glanced down at his torn jacket and snow-covered sneakers, suddenly painfully aware of how he looked. But he took a deep breath and stepped inside. The warmth hit him immediately, wrapping around him like a blanket. The officer at the front desk glanced up, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to concern. "Hey there, kid. You all right?" he asked. Ryan nodded, though his voice caught in his throat. He walked up to the desk, placing the box carefully on the counter. I found this under a bench," he said quietly, his words shaky but firm. "There's a check inside. I think someone lost it." The officer raised an eyebrow and opened the box, his eyes widening as he saw the check. This is a lot of money," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. He looked back at Ryan, studying him carefully. "You brought this here all by yourself?" Ryan nodded again, shifting nervously on his feet. "It's not mine," he said simply. "I didn't know what else to do." For a moment, the officer just stared at him. Then he smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made Ryan feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. "You did the right thing, kid," the officer said. "Most people wouldn't have." The words hit Ryan like a wave, washing away the doubts and fears that had been weighing him down. For the first time that night, he felt a sense of calm, as if the storm inside him had finally passed. Ryan stood nervously in the corner of the police station as the officer examined the check and made a few calls. The warmth of the room should have been comforting, but instead, he felt exposed. The station buzzed with activity, officers chatting, phones ringing, a man arguing about a parking ticket. But Ryan felt like all eyes were on him. He clutched his backpack tightly, trying to stay invisible. After what felt like forever, the officer returned. His face was unreadable, and Ryan's heart sank. What if they think I stole it? What if I get in trouble? The officer crouched slightly to meet Ryan's gaze, his expression softening. "The check's real," he said, "and it belongs to someone who's been looking for it." Ryan blinked, unsure how to respond. A mix of relief and sadness washed over him. "So that's it. It's going back to them. I'll leave here just like I came, cold, hungry, and alone." But before he could say anything, the officer smiled. "The person who owns this wants to meet you." Ryan's eyes widened. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because," the officer replied, "not everyone would have done what you did tonight. They want to thank you." A few minutes later, a man walked into the station. He was older, with silver hair and kind eyes, dressed in a long black coat that looked expensive. He carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. But the moment he saw Ryan, his expression softened into something warm and genuine. "You must be the boy who found my gift," the man said, his voice calm but full of emotion. Ryan nodded slowly, unsure what to say. The man knelt slightly to be at eye level, studying Ryan carefully. "What's your name?" "Ryan," he said quietly, his hands tightening around the straps of his backpack. "Well, Ryan," the man said, "I'm Mr. Hargrove, and I owe you a big thank you." He gestured toward the box on the counter, the one Ryan had carried all the way here. That check was a mistake. It wasn't supposed to be in that box. I was delivering gifts to families who need them, and somehow it slipped out. If you hadn't brought it here—" He paused, shaking his head. "I don't even want to think about what could have happened." Ryan felt a pang of guilt. For a moment he'd considered keeping it. The temptation had been so strong, but he hadn't. And now, seeing the relief in Mr. Hargrove's eyes, he knew he'd made the right choice. "It wasn't mine," Ryan said simply. "I didn't know what else to do." Mr. Hargrove smiled, and for a moment there was silence between them. Then he glanced at the officer and nodded. "Can you give us a moment?" The officer stepped away, giving them space. Mr. Hargrove turned back to Ryan, his expression serious but kind. "Ryan, I don't know your story, but I can see it's been a hard one. What you did tonight took courage and honesty, and I think the world could use a lot more of that." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope, pressing it into Ryan's hands. Ryan stared at it, confused. "What's this?" he asked. "Open it," Mr. Hargrove said, his smile returning. With shaky fingers, Ryan tore open the envelope. Inside was a deed to a small apartment, prepaid for a year. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the paper, unable to believe what he was seeing. Is this real?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Very real," Mr. Hargrove said. "And it's yours. You've had enough hard days, Ryan. It's time for a fresh start." Tears welled up in Ryan's eyes, and he blinked quickly, trying to hide them. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "You don't have to say anything," Mr. Hargrove replied. "Just promise me one thing." Ryan nodded. "Anything." "Promise me you'll never stop being the person you were tonight. Honest, kind, and brave, no matter how hard life gets." Ryan nodded again, his chest tight with emotion. "I promise." That night, Ryan walked into his new apartment for the first time. It was small, with bare walls and a single bed in the corner, but it was warm. For the first time in over a year, he had a place to call home. He sat on the bed, clutching the deed, and let the tears fall freely. They weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, gratitude, and hope. For the first time in a long time, Ryan felt like his life was starting to turn around. And it all began with a choice to do the right thing even when it wasn't easy. The days that followed felt like a dream for Ryan. For the first time in over a year, he didn't wake up shivering or hungry. The small apartment was humble, with second-hand furniture and creaky floors, but to him it felt like a castle. He spent hours sitting by the window, staring out at the city, still trying to believe it was real. On the kitchen counter sat the deed Mr. Hargrove had given him, a constant reminder of how quickly life could change. Every time he looked at it, he thought about the decision he'd made that night, how close he'd come to taking the check for himself, and how different his life might have been if he had. The thought left him with a sense of quiet pride. He hadn't just found a home. He'd found a part of himself he thought he'd lost. One evening, as Ryan sat at the small dining table eating a bowl of hot soup, he heard a knock at the door. He opened it cautiously, half expecting to see Mr. Hargrove. Instead, it was a young woman holding a notebook and a microphone, with a cameraman behind her. "Are you Ryan?" she asked, smiling warmly. Ryan nodded, his heart racing. "Yes," he said, his voice uncertain. "I'm Julie from Channel 8 News," she explained. "Your story's been going around, the boy who found $1 million check and chose to return it. People are calling you a hero." Ryan's cheeks flushed. "I'm not a hero," he said quietly. "I just did what was right." Julie's smile widened. "That's exactly why people want to hear about you. Would you mind if we talked for a few minutes?" Ryan hesitated, glancing back at the cozy apartment. He wasn't used to attention, and the idea of being on the news made him nervous. But then he thought about Mr. Hargrove's words. "Promise me you'll never stop being the person you were tonight." If his story could inspire even one person to do the right thing, it would be worth it. "Okay," he said finally, stepping aside to let them in. The interview aired the next day, and to Ryan's surprise, it sparked an outpouring of kindness. People from all over the city reached out, sending letters, small gifts, and even offers to help him get back on his feet. A local school donated supplies and arranged for him to attend classes starting the next semester. A community group offered to help furnish his apartment, bringing in warm blankets, books, and even a little Christmas tree decorated with handmade ornaments. For the first time in years, Ryan didn't feel invisible. The city that had once seemed so cold and distant now felt like it was reaching out to him, wrapping him in a warmth he hadn't known since his mother passed away. Every gesture, big or small, reminded him of the power of compassion. As the weeks turned into months, Ryan's life began to take shape. He attended school where he discovered a love for writing, telling stories that captured the beauty of resilience and kindness. He volunteered at the same shelter where he used to eat, helping others who were in the same position he'd once been in. Through it all, he stayed in touch with Mr. Hargrove, who became a mentor and friend. They often met for coffee, where Mr. Hargrove would share stories of his own struggles and how acts of honesty and integrity had shaped his life. "You've got something special, Ryan," Mr. Hargrove said one afternoon. "Never forget that." Ryan smiled, his confidence growing with each passing day. "Thanks to you, I won't." Years later, as Ryan sat at his desk in a sunlit room, typing the final words of his first book, he paused to reflect on how far he'd come. The book was about his journey, the $1 million check, the decision that changed everything and the lessons he'd learned along the way. He hoped it would remind people that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, can lead to unexpected and beautiful outcomes. He smiled as he typed the final sentence. Kindness isn't just a choice, it's a gift, and sometimes it's the greatest gift of all. Ryan's story wasn't just about a homeless boy who returned a $1 million check. It was about the choices we all face in life. He could have let desperation drive him, but instead he chose integrity. That choice didn't just change his life, it inspired countless others. His decision to return the check reminded people of a truth that often gets lost in the rush of daily life. Kindness and honesty have the power to ripple out and create change far beyond what we can see. Ryan could never have imagined that one act of courage would lead to a new home, an education, and a future he never thought possible. What about you? Have you ever faced a moment where doing the right thing felt like the hardest choice? Maybe you're holding on to a dream, but fear or doubt is keeping you from taking the first step. Ryan's story is a reminder that even in the hardest times, staying true to yourself can open doors you didn't even know were there. The world is full of challenges, but it's also full of possibilities. Every choice you make, no matter how small, has the power to shape your future and maybe even inspire someone else. If Ryan's journey inspired you, share this story with someone who might need a little hope today. And if you believe in the power of resilience, kindness, and courage, subscribe for more stories that remind us of the best in humanity. Your story could be next.